Edward Colston grew up to a merchant family in Bristol and is known for his role within the transatlantic slave trade in the 1680s, where he was a member of the Royal African Company. This English-based company traded gold, silver, ivory, and slaves. These slaves were bought in West Africa and transported to the Americas, where their labor was utilized by tobacco and sugar plantation owners. During this process, it was estimated they transported nearly 84,000 men, women, and children, and of these 19,000 died. Colston gained much of his fortune through this and donated lots of it to several Bristol charities, schools, and hospitals. This led Bristol to honour his benevolence by erecting a statue of him in 1895 and named several famous landmarks after his name. However, more recently, there has been a change in attitudes towards Colston, with the BLM protests in Bristol resulting in a toppling of his statue, it being dragged along the streets, essentially built on slave trade wealth, and being dumped into the floating harbour just like the slaves were. These protests were ignited by the continuous murdering of innocent black people by white policemen and aimed as a call for justice and freedom of black people. More specifically for Bristol, these protests aim to outline its roots in slavery and therefore injustice to black people, as well as protesting against its racial inequality. Therefore, Colston's statue was torn down as his actions resulted in the death of thousands of black men, women, and children, and was an example of this racial injustice. To put this into context, we were first introduced to Colston in our second week of lectures, when we researched forced labour within Bristol, and more specifically, its links to the transatlantic slave trade. During this, we learnt who Colston was, his link to the slave trade, and as well as to Bristol. Additionally, we were also introduced to him during our third week of lectures, when we further researched forced labour in Bristol and looked at the BLM protests which ignited the toppling of his statue. After Colston's statue was torn down, there were questions as to who/what would replace it. Jen Reid was one significant person who replaced Colston's statue, even if it was for only a day.
Delving deeper into our line of inquiry, we researched into the life of Jen Reid and her involvement within the BLM protests in Bristol, June 2020. After the momentous fall of Colston's statue in Bristol, the slave trader's plinth was empty for the first time in more than a century. During the BLM protests, the activist and protester Jen Reid climbed onto the newly empty plinth and raised her fist in a salute, which became a viral image of the protests. A new statue appeared on the 15th of July in the form of a sculpture of Jen Reid raising her fist. The statue was called A Surge of Power, created by the British sculptor Mark Quinn, but within 24 hours Bristol City Council had removed it, as it was not an improved installation. A key source of research was the BBC documentary Statue Wars, One Summer in Bristol, which followed Marvin Rees, the Mayor of Bristol, during the summer of 2020, trying to navigate the fall of Colston. Marvin Rees made the decision to remove the statue of Jen Reid less than 24 hours after it had been installed, saying that Bristol should decide what replaced Colston, not a London-based artist. In the documentary, many Bristolians encouraged and celebrated the statue, indicating how Jen Reid's pivotal role as a figurehead for change is a largely positive impact on Bristol. However, it was interesting to see the reaction to the documentary, as it was reported that Jen Reid could not believe that the makers of the BBC documentary did not approach her to talk about it. Furthermore, the activist said that she was deeply concerned at the comments made by Marvin Rees within it. Speaking to the Bristol Post, Jen Reid said, "The reason that I got on the plinth in the first place, and the reason I agreed to let the statue be made, was because consistently black women like me are denied a voice in society." In response to her lack of involvement within the documentary, Jen stated, "It feels as though to them again I am just a body with no thoughts, no mind, no contribution."
Jen Reid is originally from Bath, but now resides in Bristol. She and her parents have lived in this vibrant city for years, but have kept to themselves in terms of protest and speaking out against authority. According to a BBC Sounds interview with Jen, her parents were from the Windrush generation, and told her to keep her head down and stay away from these types of situations, as to not draw attention to the family. However, when the BLM movement began, Jen was researching her family's history, and found out that her 3 times great-grandmother was sold into slavery. This led to 3 generations of her family being forced into labour and into inhumane living conditions. Upon finding out about her disrespected ancestors, a spark was triggered within Jen, and she decided to take part in her first ever protest. The protest she took part in was a toppling at the statue of Edward Colston. This was a day of major change in Bristol, and Jen made it all the more poignant by not only participating, but by becoming a figurehead, a beacon, for the black community by adorning the plinth that once stood Colston with herself, fist in the air and head held high.
In light of the protests and the toppling of Colston's statue, in which Jen Reid played a large part, the Mayor of Bristol announced the formation of the Bristol History Commission in September 2020. Its main aim was to help the population better understand the city's history and understand how it's been shaped by the events of the past. It's made up of local academics and historians with varying cultural and academic backgrounds that can help to lead the Commission to achieve its goals. Its initial theme will be focused on the events surrounding Colston statue and how it can be replaced. However, the Commission will then go on to look at a number of different themes, such as the suffragettes, campaigning for emancipation, effects of the war, and the industrial history of the city. Since the formation of the committee in early 2021, they have met monthly and discussed both ways of educating the city on its history of slavery, as well as what to do about the empty plinth. In April 2021, an organisation called Cargo approached the Commission about a potential virtual platform. Since then, they have developed a website called the People's Platform, which is a space where people can submit their own ideas to be made into a virtual 3D model, which can be seen by anyone using a smartphone when visiting the statue. Submissions come from a wide variety of demographics, which helps encapsulate the cultural diversity of Bristol, and each model comes with its own story, which allows visitors to explore a number of different stories when visiting. After seeing the success of what had been done to the empty plinth, we were interested to know how the Cultural Committee were going to educate people on the story of the statue and the process to ensure the events were never forgotten. After looking through the meeting records of the committee, I discovered that a local artist from Bristol called Ralph Hoyt has been commissioned to create a soundscape tour of Colston's last journey. This will launch in spring 2022 and will be accessible to everyone. It is a tour on your phone that tells the story of the protest, the statue, and the history of the area depending on where you are. It starts you off at the empty plinth and will talk through the toppling of the statue as well as the history of Colston, and will take you on the exact route the statue took during the protest to areas such as Broad Quay and Perry's Bridge. Whilst moving around, it will discuss the protests in Colston as well as the wider history of the area. For example, when you get to the port, it will show ghost ships such as the Black Prince and the Snow Africa, and will talk through the port's history and links to slavery. This will help to achieve the History Commission's wider goal of education, as it will cover such a wide variety of different historical events that took place in the area.
In following our line of inquiry, we searched for academic articles that were relevant and read over them for any further information that we had not yet learned. The readings included interesting new information as well as wider context. Nassar's article mentions the Why is My Curriculum White campaign at UCL and accusations that the educational system ignores the difficult aspects of British imperial histories. Hall's article interestingly suggests that Reid's statue could be put up opposite Colston's as a kind of face-off. Choxey's article points out that Reid's statue was only up for a day, while Colston's was up for 124 years, erected long after the slave trade was abolished. Lastly, Branscome's essay talks about the acts of retaliation after Colston's statue was pulled down, including those aimed at Scipio Africanus and poet Alfred Fagan, and that there were only 7 statues representing African women on display in Britain. These articles helped us gain more of an understanding of the context and the consequences of the events surrounding the plinth. In addition, we used various sources to conduct our research. We used many news and website articles, such as The Guardian and Bristol Post, which gave us a timeline of the events and immediate reporting of actions and comments by different people. We also watched an ITV interview with Jen Reid, where she explains what the Colston statue falling meant to her and what she has done since to spread awareness. We also listened to BBC Radio 4's Descendants, where Jen Reid talks about her family history and how she's related to slavery and the Windrush generation. Finally, we watched the BBC documentary Statue Wars, which follows Bristol's Mayor Marvin Rees as he and the city respond to the events which followed the toppling of the Colston statue. On our trip to Bristol, we visited 2 places that were important to our line of inquiry. Firstly, we saw the plinth where Colston's and subsequently Jen Reid's statues were standing. This allowed us to photograph the plinth and analyse any remaining evidence of the BLM protests, such as damage and graffiti or writing. We then visited the Shed Museum to see the exposition of Colston's statue and the protests. This was valuable for learning about the context and the reasons for the statue being pulled down, as well as what has happened to the plinth and in Bristol since. We found the timeline to be especially useful. Our line of inquiry started in weeks 2 and 3 with the forced labour block, where we were first introduced to Colston and his statue and then Jen Reid. This led to us doing general online searches to explore who Jen Reid is and gather information about her statue and what has happened to the plinth in Bristol. We did further research based on sources we had found during this online exploration, leading us to more detailed data such as interviews with Reid and the Statue Wars documentary focusing on Bristol's mayor and his decisions. In order to further expand our understanding, we searched for academic texts that were relevant to the line of inquiry. These texts provided additional information as well as broader context for the topic. Visiting Bristol gave us the opportunity to see and feel the place where the statues had been moved, as well as allowing us to visit the exhibition at the museum and gain further knowledge in Bristol itself. This has been the overall process our line of inquiry has followed in order to research who Jen Reid is, her influence on Bristol, and the timeline of events related to the plinth.